June 15, 1944, dawn breaks over the Pacific island of Saipan, and the silence before the storm carries a deceptive tranquility. The volcanic beaches shimmer under the rising sun, their black sand still cool from the night. In the pre-dawn darkness, 30,000 American Marines crouch in landing craft, the salt spray stinging their faces, the diesel fumes mixing with the smell of sweat and gun oil. Each man checks his rifle, the M1 Garand, 8 pounds of walnut and steel, the weapon they've trained with until loading it became as natural as breathing. Above them, naval guns begin their thunderous overture, shells screaming overhead to pound Japanese positions hidden in the island's caves and ridges. The sound is apocalyptic, a mechanical thunder that seems to shake the very ocean itself. But if you want to understand what happened in the hell that followed, if you want to know why this battle became a turning point not just in territory, but in the psychology of war itself, you need to rewind the clock 3 years earlier, to a time when Japan's military stood at the pinnacle of what it believed was inevitable destiny, and America's soldiers carried a rifle that enemy intelligence officers dismissed with contempt, the M1 Garand. When General Douglas MacArthur called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, he wasn't speaking in hyperbole, he was stating a technical reality that would reshape modern warfare. But in the summer of 1941, as Japanese planners prepared for their expansion across the Pacific, their intelligence dossiers on American small arms made for reassuring reading. The Americans, they noted, had finally replaced their bolt-action Springfield rifles with this new semi-automatic weapon. Japanese military analysts examined captured examples and intercepted technical manuals. Their conclusions were filed away with bureaucratic confidence. The M1 was clever, certainly perhaps even ingenious in its engineering, but it possessed a fatal flaw that would doom American riflemen in close combat: the H-round and block clip. Japanese officers, trained in the philosophy of Bushido and the doctrines of aggressive assault, saw this design feature as an exploitable weakness. The Garand's internal magazine fed from a single metal clip holding exactly 8 rounds. When the 8th cartridge fired, the empty clip ejected upward with a distinctive metallic pinga sound that rang clear in and through the chaos of battle. To Japanese tactical doctrine, this was a gift. That ping meant empty. That ping meant vulnerable. That ping meant attack. Imperial training manuals began including specific instructions: listen for the clip ejection, count the enemy's shots, time your banzai charges for the moment of American weakness. When their vaunted rifles fell silent for reloading, they laughed at it. In officers' clubs from Tokyo to Manila, in training camps across the home islands, the story of the American rifle that announced its own emptiness became a point of dark humor. How typical of Western thinking to build a sophisticated weapon and then engineer into it a warning bell for the enemy. The Americans, for all their industrial might, didn't understand the warrior spirit. They didn't understand that the moment of vulnerability, that 3-second window when a Marine fumbled for a fresh clip, was all a dedicated soldier needed to close the distance and settle the fight with cold steel. This confidence was built on a foundation that seemed unshakable in those early warriors. Since December 7, 1941, Japanese forces had swept across the Pacific with stunning speed. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered after just over 2 months. The Philippines, defended by American and Filipino forces, collapsed after a brutal campaign. Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, Guam, the Red Sun banner rose over them all. Japanese soldiers had proven themselves in jungle and city, in tropical heat and mountain cold. They were disciplined, fanatical when necessary, and absolutely convinced of their spiritual superiority. American forces, when they had stood and fought, had often fought bravely, but they had lost repeatedly. The Japanese infantryman of 1942 was a formidable opponent. His Arisaka Type 99 rifle was bolt-action, certainly slower than the American semi-automatic, but he had been trained to make every shot count, to close with the enemy, to trust in his bayonet and his willingness to die. He traveled light, ate little, endured appalling hardships without complaint. He had been told that Americans were soft, that they loved comfort and luxury, that they would break when the fighting became desperate. And for a while, the evidence seemed to support this belief. But by June of 1944, the tide had turned in ways that Japanese high command was only beginning to comprehend. Guadalcanal had been the first shock 6 months of savage fighting that ended in Japanese retreat. Then came the island-hopping campaign, each American landing better planned, better supplied, more overwhelming than the last. Tarawa's bloody beaches, Kwajalein's fortress defenses, the Marshall Islands all had fallen to American forces that seemed to learn and adapt with terrifying speed. And now the Americans were coming to Saipan, just 1,300 miles from Tokyo itself, close enough to base the newbie 29 Superfortress bombers that could rain destruction on the home islands. The 32,000 Japanese defenders of Saipan knew what was at stake. They had transformed the island into a fortress, digging caves into the volcanic rock, positioning artillery to create killing zones on the invasion beaches, preparing for the kind of desperate defense that had made every Pacific island a charnel house. Their commander, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Sato, had issued clear orders: not one step backward. Die where you stand. Make the Americans pay for every yard of ground in rivers of blood. Among his troops were veterans of China and Manchuria, hardened soldiers who had seen combat and survived. They were ready for the American Marines. They were ready for the naval bombardment and the aircraft and the tanks. They had studied American tactics and American weapons, but they were not ready for what those weapons, in the hands of increasingly veteran American troops, could actually do. The first waves hit the beaches at 8:40 a.m. on June 15th. The Japanese response was immediate and devastating. Artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire tore into the Marines as they struggled up from the waterline. Men fell in the surf, their blood mixing with the salt water. Amtraks burned, their hulls split open by concealed guns. It was Tarawa all over again, or so it seemed. That horrifying combination of American courage and Japanese defensive savagery that turned sand and coral into meat grinders. But this time was different. This time, the Marines who made it off the beaches didn't just survive, they fought back with a firepower that stunned their defenders. The M1 Garand had been carried at Guadalcanal and Tarawa, certainly, but now, in mid-1944, virtually every Marine rifleman bore one. The Springfield bolt actions were gone, relegated to sniper variants, and these Marines had learned how to use them. A bolt-action rifle, even in expert hands, could fire perhaps 15 aimed shots per minute. The Arisaka Type 99, the standard Japanese rifle, was a solid weapon, but its operator had to work the bolt manually after each shot pullback. Eject the spent casing, chamber a new round, close the bolt, aim, fire. 15 rounds per minute from a very good rifleman, 20 if he was exceptional and not worried about accuracy. The M1 Garand, in those same expert hands, could fire 40 to 50 aimed shots per minute. The semi-automatic action meant the shooter only had to pull the trigger. The rifle itself ejected the spent casing, chambered the next round, recocked the firing mechanism. The shooter's eye never left the sight picture. 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger. Then a fresh clip, loaded in less than 2 seconds by a trained Marine. And 8 more rounds downrange. Do the mathematics of modern warfare. And a horrifying reality emerges. An 8-man Marine rifle squad, all armed with Garands, could put out nearly 400 rounds per minute of sustained, aimed rifle fire. A Japanese infantry squad, typically 13 men with bolt-action rifles, might manage 200 rounds per minute, and that's if every man was an expert marksman working his bolt with desperate speed. The Americans had doubled the firepower of their basic infantry unit, not through numbers, but through engineering. But the Japanese had their counter tactic, carefully taught, widely understood, the banzai charge. Time for those moments when the Americans reloaded. When that distinctive ping sang out across the battlefield like a dinner bell, the first night on Saipan, Japanese forces launched a series of counterattacks against the Marine beachhead. They came in waves, soldiers screaming banzai, and Marine, you die, charging through the darkness with bayonets fixed, grenades in hand, accepting death as the price of closing with the enemy. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. It was what they had been trained to do, and they had broken American positions before with exactly this kind of fanatical courage. But on the marine perimeter, something unexpected happened. The charging Japanese soldiers heard the pings, yes, those telltale metallic rings that signaled empty rifles. They surged forward into what should have been that precious 3-second window of vulnerability, and they ran into a wall of continuous fire that cut them down like wheat before a scythe. Because what Japanese intelligence had failed to understand, what their tactical manuals had missed, was how American Marines had adapted to their own weapons characteristics. The M1's clip ejection wasn't a bug, it was a feature that smart infantry had learned to exploit. Marines fought in fire teams and squads, not as individual warriors. When one man's rifle pinged empty, 3 others in his team were still firing. The reloading Marine had covering fire. More than that, veteran NCOs had taught their men a trick that turned the supposed weakness into a weapon: the false ping. A Marine would manually eject a partially loaded clip, creating that distinctive sound, and immediately slam in a fresh 8-round clip. Japanese soldiers, hearing the ping and believing they had a window of opportunity, would leap up to charge or expose themselves to fire, and they would be cut down by a fully loaded rifle and 7 others alongside it. The sound became a lure. The ping became bait. What Japanese doctrine had identified as an exploitable vulnerability had become a trap that killed hundreds of their soldiers, but it went deeper than tactical tricks. The fundamental reality was that the M1 Garand, backed by American industrial might and logistics, had changed the nature of infantry combat in ways that Bushido and spiritual training couldn't overcome. A Marine could carry 80 rounds of .3006 ammunition in 10 8-round clip standard combat load. He could fire all 80 rounds in less than 2 minutes of sustained combat, and every one of those rounds could be carefully aimed. A Japanese soldier with his Arisaka might carry 60 rounds, and even if he somehow managed to fire all 60, it would take him for minutes of continuous bolt working, and his accuracy would degrade as fatigue set in. The Japanese soldier was brave, he was skilled, he was determined, but he was equipped for a war that belonged to an earlier age. Facing an enemy who had industrialized violence in ways that courage alone couldn't answer. By June 20th, 5 days into the battle, the Marines had pushed inland into Saipan's interior, a nightmare landscape of cane fields, rocky outcroppings, and caves where Japanese defenders could hide and ambush. Every advance was contested. Every hillock hid a machine gun position. The fighting was savage, intimate, and utterly exhausting. But the Americans kept moving forward, kept applying pressure, kept bringing that overwhelming firepower to bear. Japanese soldiers began to record their experiences in diaries and letters that would later be recovered from their bodies. The tone shifted from confidence to desperation. They wrote about the terrifying volume of American fire, the way Marine squads could suppress their positions with rifle fire alone, without even needing to call in their mortars or artillery. "We cannot raise our heads," one letter home described. "The moment we attempt to fire, 10 American rifles answer. Our officers say to wait for the sound of their rifles emptying, but the rifles never empty. Always they are shooting." Another diary found on a dead sergeant described a night assault. "We charged with the spirit of the samurai. We heard their rifles go empty, the clear sound, like a bell. We ran forward to kill them in their moment of weakness. But they were not weak. The shooting never stopped. My entire squad was killed. I do not understand how this is possible." They didn't understand because they had been told a story about American weakness, about American technical short-sightedness, about how their own spiritual strength would overcome material advantage. But the M1 Garand wasn't just a piece of technology, it was a symbol of a completely different way of thinking about war. American doctrine didn't prize individual warrior spirit above all else. It prized systems, logistics, combined arms, and the multiplication of force through engineering and teamwork. The rifle was designed to be maintained by average soldiers, to be reliable in mud and sand and rain, to be mass-produced in quantities that would have seemed fantastic to Japanese planners. By 1944, Springfield Armory, Winchester, and Harrington and Richardson were producing Garands at a combined rate of 50,000 rifles per month. Every month, American industry wasn't just making weapons, it was drowning the enemy in them. Japanese factories, their resources strained by 3 years of war and the American submarine blockade, were struggling to produce 15,000 Airsacker rifles per month. The numbers told a story that no amount of courage could rewrite, and it wasn't just rifles. The Marines on Saipan were backed by a logistical system that seemed like science fiction to their Japanese opponents. Ammunition came ashore in endless streams, not just enough to fight, but enough to fire freely, to suppress enemy positions, to saturate target areas. American soldiers were taught to use their ammunition, not hoard it. When in doubt, shoot, the doctrine said. We have plenty. Japanese defenders, by contrast, were increasingly ordered to conserve ammunition, to make every shot count, to save rounds for the final desperate defense. They had been isolated on Saipan, cut off from resupply, rationing everything from bullets to rice. They were starving and running low on ammunition while fighting an enemy that seemed to have unlimited supplies of both food and firepower. The symbolic contrast was impossible to ignore. When American positions were overrun, Japanese soldiers found things that shocked them: ration boxes filled with canned meat, chocolate bars, cigarettes, instant coffee. Letters from home spoke of a country where civilians had access to luxuries that Japanese soldiers couldn't imagine. One captured diary described finding a dead Marine's pack. He carried more food in his bag than I have eaten in a week: chocolate, preserved fruit, crackers with cheese, and his rifle so clean, so perfect, like it came new from a factory. Our rifles are worn. We have no oil to clean them. We have rice that is moldy and ammunition that is rationed. How can we win against this? That question, how can we win against this, began to haunt the defenders of Saipan as the battleground on through late June. The answer, increasingly clear, was that they couldn't, not because they lacked courage or skill or determination, but because they were fighting an enemy that had brought industrialized total war to a level that made traditional military virtues insufficient. On July 6th, with the battle clearly lost, General Sato ordered a final massive banzai charge, the largest of the entire Pacific War. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, many wounded, some armed only with bamboo spears, charged into American positions in a last desperate attempt to die with honor and inflict maximum casualties. It was brave beyond measure. It was also suicide. Marine and Army positions, dug in and well supplied, met the charge with every weapon they had: machine guns, rifles, grenades, artillery. The firing was so intense that gun barrels glowed red in the darkness. The M1 Garands sang their distinctive song, ping, 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 as clips ejected and fresh ones were slammed home. And the firing never stopped, never slowed, never gave the charging Japanese soldiers the opening they needed. Bodies piled up in windows and drifts. The charge broke against American firepower like a wave against a seawall. When dawn came, more than 4,000 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The center of the American line had bent but never broken. The battle for Saipan was effectively over, though fighting would continue for several more days as the remaining defenders retreated to the island's northern cliffs, where hundreds of Japanese civilians and soldiers would choose death over surrender, leaping from the heights into the sea below. The Americans had lost over 3,000 killed and more than 13,000 wounded taking Saipan. The price had been horrific, but they had taken it, and in doing so, had delivered a psychological blow to Japan that was perhaps more devastating than the physical loss of the island. Saipan was close enough to Tokyo that residents of the capital could imagine if they closed their eyes and truly imagined American bombers flying overhead, which they soon would. But there was another lesson in the volcanic soil of Saipan, one inscribed in empty 8-round clips and in the shocked final writings of Japanese soldiers who had believed they understood their enemy's weakness. The lesson was this: modern war wasn't won by individual courage or spiritual superiority or the willingness to die. It was won by systems, by logistics, by the ability to mass-produce excellence and distribute it to every soldier in the line. The M1 Garand was just a rifle, Yes, but it was a rifle that represented a completely different philosophy of warfare, one that integrated engineering, industry, doctrine, and human training into a weapon system that multiplied the effectiveness of every soldier who carried it. Japanese doctrine had taught that the American rifle's clip ejection sound was a weakness to exploit. But exploitation requires capability, and capability requires resources, and resources require an intact industrial base and supply chain. By 1944, Japan was losing all three. Their soldiers were still brave, still skilled, still willing to die, but they were being asked to fight the future with the weapons and doctrines of the past. Consider the symbolic weight of that sound, the ping of an M1 Garand ejecting its empty clip. To American Marines, it became the sound of a job done right, 8 rounds fired, time to reload and get back in the fight. To Japanese soldiers, it had been promised as the sound of opportunity, but it had become the sound of terror because it was never alone. It was always surrounded by the crack of other rifles still firing, always followed within seconds by the resumption of fire from the reloaded weapon. That ping became the soundtrack of their defeat, a metallic note that rang out across Pacific Islands, a sound that said, "We have so many bullets that we can afford to let you hear when one rifle runs dry because 7 others are covering it. And the one that's dry will be loaded again before you can close half the distance." There was something almost contemptuous about it. Though no American Marine thought in those terms. They were just using their weapons as trained, fighting as units, relying on their logistics and their teamwork. But to the enemy, the sheer abundance that the ping represented, the casual, almost wasteful abundance of ammunition, of firepower, of industrial production was overwhelming. Japan was a nation that had been rationing resources since the 1930s, that told its citizens and soldiers to endure hardship for the emperor, that made virtue of scarcity. America was a nation that had converted its automobile factories to produce tanks and aircraft, that fed its soldiers 3 hot meals a day even on jungle islands, that could afford to give every infantryman a semi-automatic rifle when most of the world's armies still carried bolt-actions. The M1 Garand wasn't just a superior weapon, it was a statement of philosophy. We believe our soldiers' lives are valuable enough to give them the best tools we can engineer. We believe in winning through material superiority, not spiritual sacrifice. We believe in making our enemies die for their country, not in dying for ours. By the time Saipan fell on July 9, 1944, the strategic situation in the Pacific was irreversible. Japan would fight on for another year, and that fighting would be terrible. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the firebombing of Japanese cities, and ultimately the atomic bombs that would force surrender. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. The nation that could produce M1 Garands by the tens of thousands each month, that could supply its soldiers so thoroughly that they could fight with ammunition to spare, that could engineer victory through industrial and technical superiority, that nation was going to win years later. After the war, military historians and veterans would debate the lessons of the Pacific Campaign. Books would be written about tactics and strategy, about the island-hopping campaign, about the submarine war that strangled Japan's economy. But among the veterans themselves, especially the Marines who had fought on those volcanic islands, there was a simpler understanding. They had been given a weapon that was simply better than what the enemy had. Not better because it was blessed or spiritually superior or wielded by inherently superior warriors. Better because it was engineered to be better, mass-produced to be reliable, and integrated into a doctrine that maximized its strengths. The M1 Garand did exactly what it was designed to do. It allowed an American rifleman to put more accurate fire-down range in less time than his opponent could. Everything else, the courage, the unique cohesion, the willingness to close with the enemy, that was still necessary. But the rifle gave them an edge, a concrete, measurable advantage that saved lives and won battles. The ping of an ejected clip, that sound that Japanese intelligence had identified as a fatal flaw, became in the end the sound of American industrial might, of a nation that could afford to fight a war on the other side of the planet and supply its soldiers so thoroughly that even their basic infantrymen carried a weapon that represented the cutting edge of military technology. It was the sound of empire declining and new power rising. It was the sound of a page turning in history. On Saipan today, you can walk the invasion beaches where 30,000 Marines came ashore that June morning in 1944. The volcanic sand is still black, though now it's peaceful, marked by memorials and monuments. The caves where Japanese defenders made their last stands are open to tourists. The cliffs where thousands died are quiet, the waves still breaking against the rocks below. And sometimes, if you listen very carefully in the wind, you can almost hear it, that distinctive metallic ping, echoing across the decades, the sound of history turning. The sound of a weapon that was supposed to announce its own weakness, but instead announced the future of warfare. The sound that Japanese soldiers learned too late was not an invitation to attack, but a promise that American firepower was measured not in single rifles, but in coordinated units. In industrial production, in a way of war that would reshape the world. They laughed at the M1 Garand's ping. But by the time they understood what it really meant, the laughter had died in their throats, replaced by the sound of semi-automatic fire rolling across Pacific islands like thunder. -1 rounds at a time, clip after clip after clip. A sound that said, "We have plenty and you have run out."